Part 6. The Choice. The choice before us, life or death. There must always be remedy in law. We live in and have our existence in a free will universe, and therefore only by the voluntary consent of the willing participant is any of this possible. This is why the lofty-sounding phrase, government by the consent of the governed, found in the Declaration of Independence sounds so reassuring, and yet is the most insidious phrase found in that document. Everything is structured to gain that voluntary consent where silence is acquiescence, and the failure to timely and properly object becomes the prima facie evidence to support the ongoing presumption of consent. The remedy is the fact that, through the biological incarnate form we hold as our bodies and genetic ancestral code, we can claim our life and prove standing in life. The split in the road now upon us is the literal bifurcation between life and death. The matrix is a cult of death. It is the realm of death, the real estate or royal estate, which is in fact completely hardwired to death. The denial of this is what is meant by the phrase, those with eyes to see, because if one's eyes are open yet they do not see these facts, one is without eyes that truly see. Nevertheless, it is there for those with eyes to see that the path to take is the one leading back to the land of the living. When our mothers informed us as the original corpus by literally accepting the role as informant on the registration form for the certificate of live birth, we were declared a ward of the state, and the presumption prevailed that our estate was abandoned. That's the lawful ancestral estate that is recognized in global estate and trust law as being capable of being claimed by each and every lineal generational descendant. Of course, we are newborn at the time, so we can't readily stand up and claim the estate, so that is kept in abeyance until we reach majority age. That age is generally considered to be 21, and that number has high esoteric significance as the factor of 3 times 7. The numeric 3 is a key one in the hidden esoteric system that underlies the entire matrix. It signifies absolute consent upon the passage of 3 opportunities to object. Thus, at the age of 7, we reach the first stage, at which time we are now considered lost at sea in a ghost ship, a commercial vessel afloat on the Sea of Commerce. At age 14, having reached the age of puberty and the biological ability to procreate, we activate our genetic code to a secondary level and begin to approach the time when we have the conscious capacity to claim our living estate, our own bodies, and procreative capacities, and to merge with the creative capacities of the planetary and solar realities in which we exist. At this stage, if we do not claim the estate and nullify the presumption of abandonment, we are now presumed dead and without a will, having died a civil death intestate. At this stage, we can enter into a contract with the state to marry a partner, to procreate and produce offspring that continues the cycle. Additionally, we can apply to become a driver in commerce and to volunteer to hold the office of the person as registered agent of the corporate franchise. In that status, we receive legal process in the name of the U.S. person, the franchise, the commercial vessel clothed in the character of U.S. citizen, all nicely packaged when we apply for a license to drive motor vehicles. By definition, a driver is someone for hire and hence in commerce, which places the driver under the regulatory control of the United States Congress with its delegated power to control interstate commerce. This harkens back to the Supreme Court case of the propeller Genesee Chief versus Fitzhugh, where the court held, quote, "It may embrace also the vehicles and persons engaged in carrying it on." It would be in the power of Congress to confer Admiralty jurisdiction upon its courts over the cars engaged in transporting passengers or merchandise from one state to another, and over the persons engaged in conducting them, and denied to the parties the trial by jury." End quote. Thus, when we apply for and accept the license to drive as commercial drivers engaging in interstate commerce, the federal Admiralty jurisdiction can embrace us in the vehicles and persons engaged in carrying it on. In the course of the third phase, age 14 to 21, men are conscripted into the military-industrial complex war machine by registering themselves via selective service, which is mandatory for male U.S. citizens who have reached the age of 18. Both sexes can register to vote under the 1939 Voter Registration Act and subsequent National Voter Registration Acts. The 1939 Act has embedded clauses by which such registration becomes another voluntary act to allow the full pledge and hypothecation of all future production, labor, and earning capacities to the state, as part of the inviolate perpetual debt as stipulated in the 14th Amendment of 1868. This establishes our willing and voluntary agreement to be the bonded surety to the franchise and have everything created thereby be owned by the United States to use as collateral against the perpetual debt. By the time we reach our third strike at the age of 21, we are all in. We have thrice disavowed our true being and incontrovertibly placed ourselves happily in the status of bonded surety to the bankrupt franchise. In the Admiralty jurisdiction in which this operates, a bankrupt has no standing. Without standing, we can neither state or stake a claim. If we cannot stake a claim, we have no claim to the land, and without a claim on the land, we have no standing in law. We are thus totally subject to the military management and occupation of the people and territory of the conquered country, and that subject to clause means that all codes, statutes, ordinances, and so forth of the management state are applicable to us as the surety to their indebted property. In this way, we are lifted off the land into the containment field of the civil body, the civitas, bound and gagged, because we have abandoned our voice, our expressed will, as we stood mute 3 times without objection or claim. Once off the land, we are only afforded civil rights, a misnomer that is in lieu of the truth of the matter, which is civil privileges that can be taken away for any infraction against the public codes. We can then only function under permit, license, and codified controls. These are administered by the officers and agents of the bureaucracy, dutifully fulfilling the role of the all-seeing, eyeful executors of our lives and bodies. It is our bodies as landed estates, when we have landed our true spirits into the physical incarnate form, that are our true estate. Our bodies are the living substance of our eternal life stream embodied in the 3 dimensions of perceived time and space, but for as long as we do not consciously control our lives and retain the sovereignty of such landed estates, they are potentially forever bereft of our true estate, our true being, which remains beyond our reach. But it is beyond our reach only temporarily. Like Dorothy in the Land of Oz, we have always had the means to return home. The first step in the journey back home is to be willing to step out of the mass consensus hallucination reality construct and take account of our current situation. The starting point and the key is the legal and monetary systems, because the legal is based on the contractual nexus that we have established to the false hologram matrix system. When we really evaluate, research, and understand the system, we come to the inescapable conclusion that 1. We live in a free will universe, 2. In a free will universe, one can choose to bind oneself to another being or fictional entity through voluntary contractual agreement. Number 3, the entire system is designed to elicit and extract our voluntary contractual agreement to be attached to the world system and allow it to extract our life force to sustain itself and to entrain our creator capacity into projecting that life force into the creation of our own prison. Number 4, this is achieved through the nature, character, construction, and application of the legal and monetary systems, which in themselves are the crafted artifice to create an illusory monetary system that we believe is real and is the only way by which we can create anything of substance and manifestation. Number 5, this then gets down to the key point that the only way to remove ourselves from this condition is to choose to terminate the voluntary status by rescinding all signatures attached to physical, electronic, or verbal contracts that bind us, revoking all powers of attorney that we have given to the system and its actors, and terminating all agreements, oaths, vows, contracts, collateral attachments, indentured bondage, and whatever other forms of impairment that we have accepted throughout all time and space, as well as here and now in this current legal, monetary, political, religious, social construct. To be sure, this applies to all agreements, because they all bind and limit us. If one is truly content to be restricted, controlled, and limited, then by all means do not do this. But if this is not your lot or intention, then this includes religious vows and belief systems, whether traditional or clothed in the incensed and perfumed draperies of the New Age, and everything in between. As well, it includes political ideology, racial identity, genetic predisposition, cultural predilection, social segmentation, and self-imposed biological limitations, the whole lot of it. These are the belief systems that entrain the mind into limitation, and therefore a dispassionate and rigorous inventory of ourselves must be undertaken, for we must ultimately all face ourselves in brutal self-honesty and take full responsibility for all that we have created and proceed forward on the basis of the universal maxim that, quote, there are no enemies, only opportunities, end quote. Why is this maxim true or even applicable? Because if we polarize with the externally manifest and visible system as if it and its actors are the enemy, we lose sight of our own capability to respond. We forget the fact of who we actually are as the true creators of our own reality, and by so doing we eschew responsibility for what we have wrought. Without taking full responsibility for all of this, we cannot proceed with full self-empowerment to change it. But for most, this will not be a path they wish to undertake. Most people prefer to argue for their limitations and remain comfortably ensconced in their gilded cage. How does this relate to status correction and a journey through 9 hells? So, how to correct our status, reestablish our standing, and thereby regain our capacity? To answer this question, let's get into our time machine and return for a moment to the 16th century, during which period many things occurred and were put into place. Keep in mind that on the normal linear construction of time, as most perceive it, there has been a steady and inexorable continuum of putting in place the many building blocks of the world system of bondage over many thousands of years. The last 500 years has seen the implementation of the current construction of that system as we experience it today. So let's step back and observe this larger cyclical context within this 500-year period. To do that, we look at the Mayan calendar that posits a grand solar year of approximately 26,000 years, divided into 5 segments of 5,200 years each. The most recent segment started in the year 3113 BC and ended in 2012. Within each of the 5 segments are undulating periods and subcycles, one of which is known as the 13 heavens and 9 hells, each of 52 years. By undulating, we mean that they weave in and out of each other much like a biorhythm graph. On Easter Sunday, April 21, 1519, 2 things occurred. One was the beginning of the 9 hells, and the other was the arrival of the Europeans on the Mesoamerican shores in the form of Hernando Cortes arriving in Mexico on that day. He and a very small group of armed soldiers made their rapid ascent to the mountain city of Tenochtitlan, as if they knew exactly where they were going. Thus, the Spanish were soon to conquer the land of the Aztecs and Mayas, while back home in Spain, the title of Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was placed upon the head of Carlos V, grandson of Isabel and Fernando, who financed the man so-called as Christopher Columbus. By so placing the emperor's crown onto Carlos's head, this opened the phase of establishing the Holy Roman Empire in what today is known as Latin America. The task of doing this in North America was accomplished once the Hanoverian dynasty took control of the British throne, and the Treaty of Paris of 1783 identified George III as the Prince Elector and Arch-Treasurer of the Holy Roman Empire and the United States of America. This accomplished the purpose of placing the function of controlling the land and monetary systems of the world into the fold of the United States Federal Corporation in Washington, D.C. But we don't want to tarry in the very complex details of the Holy Roman Empire at this juncture, so staying with our focus on the beginning of the Spanish conquest of America and the calendar cycles of the Mayans, the period of 9 hells lasted 9 periods of 52 years each, 1519 through 1987, was also reflected in many indigenous peoples throughout the world. In various places around the world, quite a number of indigenous peoples had prophecies and expectations of this sort of roughly 500-year period of imposed domination and control based on cycles of time. Of course, the flip side is that before and after this period of hell, there would be periods of heaven. But consider that this was just another layer of control through false expectation. For endless cycles of time, mankind has been controlled by the indoctrination of belief systems that posit the concept of world suffering leads to heavenly bliss. This enables the people to convince themselves that no matter how bad it gets here, no matter how hellish or heinous the conditions are, there is something better waiting on the other side. In a larger context, this should be considered as just another seesaw of reality in which first there is heaven, then hell, then heaven, then hell, and on, never ending, and that this is just another overlay of expectation of relief from hell, only to eventually be returned right back to that condition. This is mentioned to point out that during the last 500 years, the imposition of complete dominance, control, and enslavement through the modern system of legal and monetary construction has been put in place whilst the expectation of a relief mechanism to return us to heaven was infiltrated into the consciousness of the population as the perpetual carrot on the stick. It came in many guises, including the false light reality matrix, the belief in false ascension, the biblical taking up into the heavens of true believers, and more. The reality is more pragmatic. A contract is a contract. Binding debt is binding debt. We can believe something in our minds, but the universal laws are decidedly different in application. Thus, we must absolutely sever the attachments and contractual agreements to remove ourselves from this heaven/hell dialectic and move beyond polarity and duality in order to return home. In order to do that, we must invoke our internal capacity and power to rescind, revoke, and terminate that which is no longer valid for us. In the beginning of the 17th century, Elizabeth I died in 1603 and was succeeded by James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. From his reign, we have the King James Version of the Bible and all of its lofty Shakespearean poetic voicing. We have the beginning of the New World in America with Jamestown and Virginia. This was the beginning of setting the template for a new Atlantis in America as postulated by Sir Francis Bacon, who himself was the likely leader of the team that wrote both the Shakespeare work and the King James Bible. So it is all tied together. Of course, the depth and breadth of this period and history is far beyond the scope of this paper, but the essence and time frame must be understood as the beginning of the real implementation of the 9 hells, from which the intention was that no new phase of heaven would ever be allowed again. The intent was to lead the world to a final crescendo, having billions of the population believing that it was all the precursor to the final moment of salvation, thus allowing and agreeing that all the war, violence, pestilence, poverty, disease, and environmental destruction was the mandatory precursor to the return of a Savior to take only those who believe away from it all, but never realizing that by the power of belief, such adherents were actually creating the destruction of this world and their own demise. The power of belief is a powerful thing, and those who dominate and control humanity know this fact perfectly well. In that biblical context, there is the fantasized period of peace of 1,000 years, post-Second Coming, that many expect. But this is nothing more than the bait and switch to have billions of beings project their creator capacity into the hologram to hasten the event, to clear the real estate, and have their millennium of peace, never understanding that their peace would be at the price of their being, free will, and life force. In whatever flavor, whatever genre, whatever belief system, it is always the same. Suffer, and allow the poverty and disease and destruction, and you will be rewarded in the never-to-be-realized future. James VI of Scotland, as James I, King of England, was the House of Stuart, a house whose pedigree and genetics would eventually be co-opted by other houses from other lands, namely the Prussian, Germanic, Austrian, and Italian houses that fused together to be the focus of the Holy Roman Empire that would eventually sit upon and control the land and money of the United Kingdom and United States of America through the office of the President, as the new Atlantis in America. Key to the English version of the King James Version of the law, also known as the Holy Bible, is the binding of the genetics in the book of Genesis. This is achieved by the covenant of Abraham, who must first show his absolute loyalty in one of the primary instances of trauma-based mind control, when he is required to kill his firstborn son to prove his loyalty to his God. He is first referenced as Abram, which is derived from 2 Egyptian words, Ab equaling servant, and Ra equaling Amen-Ra, the servant of Ra. When satisfied that he is indeed willing to do this, Yahweh releases him from the task, but binds him to a contract in which his seed, or genetic lineage, is forever bound to the covenant contract. Following this act, his name is changed to Abraham, the village of servants to Ra, thus creating a global village of servitude to the hidden one, Amen-Ra, the true God behind it all, a binary AI computer program of galactic proportions, and he is entitled as the King Priest of Jerusalem. This is following in the line of the 2 priest lines of Michael and Zadok, commonly known as Melchizedek. Jerusalem is derived from 2 roots, Uru equaling founded and Shalem equaling divine feminine, Thus, the king-priest is the overlay of the false masculine godhead to dominate and control the divine feminine life principle, as well as to utilize the specific geomantic network that converges on that location to extend the domination throughout the world. That geomancy of energetic control on a global scale is nothing more than the systematized program of numerology, geometry, astrology, and many more mathematically based systems that have been presented to the world as mystical and sacred and divine, when in fact they are nothing more than the underlying systems of control of our consciousness and of this world. Knowing, seeing, and understanding this point is one of the first steps to liberation of our true spirits. Insisting on the belief systems thusly presented over the millennia as sacred or divine is just one more methodology of control. These systems are very much hardwired in the system of legal and monetary bondage. Out of this placement of king and priest as the highest offices of this world emerged the restatement of the ancient ritual of establishing two pillars at the entrance of every temple, oriented to the rising sun coming over the horizon on the first day of spring on the vernal equinox. These two pillars represent the line of the king and the line of the priest, who established their lineages to control the land and the law throughout history to the present time. In the year 962 A.D., this original covenant was restated between two living men, Otto the Great and Pope John XII. The first emerged from the Carolingian Empire, beginning with Charlemagne, who himself was a descendant of the Merovingians and the Franks emerging out of southern France in the 5th century A.D., and the latter being a Roman pope whose pontificate became infamous for the alleged depravity and worldliness with which he conducted it. In their agreement was the establishment of the line of the king to be carried forward by Otto I and his descendants, and the line of the priest to be carried forward by the succession of the papacy to meet at the end of time in Jerusalem and merge the two into a singular office sitting on the worldly throne placed therein. Otto I, also known as Otto the Great, became the first Holy Roman Emperor after Charlemagne, and thus started the First Reich. The Second Reich was initiated in 1871 by the consolidation of Germany into a nation-state and the seating of Wilhelm the Kaiser. The Third Reich we are quite familiar with the ascent of Adolf Hitler as the National Socialist Party in 1932. And the Fourth Reich began at the fall of Berlin on May 1, 1945, and its transposition to the United States via Operation Paperclip. All of these points are significant when one traces the full history of the royal houses leading to the global dominance of the British Crown and monarchy, and the line of the priest in the Vatican City, Holy See, Roman Curia, and papacy. This was accomplished when the German and Italian lines from the Prussian and Venetian black nobility were fused, and the Habsburg, Hanover, Guelph, Wettin, Gotha, Saxe-Coburg, and other key family lines gained control of the English throne in 1714 with the seating of George Louis, Elector of Hanover, as George I. For a complete understanding of this, we recommend the series The Hidden King of England, which provides exhaustive detail of how this was achieved. Notice, too, the arranged timing of the fall of the Third Reich, April 30th, 1945, and the effective rebirth of the king the following day as May Day, the day of the death and rebirth of the Beltane king, in the form of the Fourth Reich to be established in America. The Two Pillars Decoded. Ultimately, this all boils down to be what is symbolically represented in all esoteric systems, secret societies, and modern corporate imagery, the two pillars. Pillar 1 is the line of the king that controls all land, and Pillar 2 is the line of the priest that controls all of the law. It is always a matter of controlling land and law. The land is the substance of this earth, where the fecundity of creation is always emerging. So the king claims the land, lifts all others off of it into the containment field of the civil body, and thus controls life. The priest creates the law that binds living men to the rules and regulations of the temple. The temple is the temporal lineal bondage of the gods of time. It is the temple of Cronus, who in Greek mythology castrated his father and threw his testicles into the sea, wherefrom sprang the fates and furies, and thereby bound humanity to its fate in time. The temple establishes both the religious binding as well as the monetary system, because originally the temples were the banks where the money was stored, and time is money. This is found in modern courts, where the clerk is in fact the cleric, holding a religious authority as well as the purse strings as cashier. The judge sits on the bench, which is the bank or bank. He or she is a magistrate or practitioner of magic, using charms and spells and sentences to convert the life force of the bonded and indentured servants, who must adhere to the law of the priest or pay the penalties for their transgressions. The judge is the black-robed priest who sits on the bench to adjudicate the banked tithing of those in bondage. This is also metaphorically represented by the two pillars as placed on the circular solar orbit of our planet, as it cycles around the solar entrapment of the solar system every year. May 1st is Beltane Day, May Day, death and rebirth of the Solar King Day, birth of the Fourth Reich Day, and Communist Workers' Day. On that day, children wind their ribbons around the maypole. Their ribbons are the symbolic double helical threads of the genetic codes of the people. Their game of maypole energetically binds the living bodies of the populace to this ritual pillar, binding the living to their cult of death and bondage. 6 months later, the second pillar is planted on November 1st as the Day of All Souls, following the Day of the Dead, All Hallows' Eve. This pillar is the stanchion to gather the departed souls who during the year have shed the mortal coils of the body, bonded to the debt karma of the matrix, falling short on their tally of the karma tokens of the gods of the matrix, and leaving their living estates behind in abandonment. The dead have abandoned their bodies, codes, genetics, life force, and estates so that they can be harvested on the earth plane, whilst their true essence, their souls, are energetically extracted of substance and then put back into the recycling system to be reincarnated and birthed once again into immediate bondage and debt enslavement. To accept the binding nature of the law of the priest is to agree to bind one's life force to the codes, statutes, canons, commercial constructs, and civil systems of the world and its bankrupt corporate natures. This is done so that the people will be the collateral for the monetized debt system and thereby be adhered to the fictional reality of the cult of death and the appearance of life, but by such adhesion made bereft of real life overall in a perpetual infinity loop of karmic debt and abandoned equitable interests. Back to the 17th century in our time machine. Returning then to the early 1600s, we see the beginning of the global commercial ventures under royal charter, the various companies emerging out of the liveries, fraternities, and guilds of the City of London known as joint stock companies, as well as from the Netherlands. This began with the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, more commonly known as the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, respectively. These are the two preeminent commercial maritime extensions of the city/corporation of London and the future intended seat of the World Court, and the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands, also known as United States. Many other companies followed, including the Virginia Company, chartered with the intent of securing the initial foothold in the Americas. This was concurrent with the Dutch West India Company that was the original claimant of a little place called New Amsterdam, also known as Manhattan. Later in the 1680s, the Virginia Company, now a royal crown colony after the original charter was revoked in 1624, was granted 5 principal capacities and powers. Number 1, the right and ability to establish administrative courts as required. 2, the right and ability to claim and hold land. 3, the right and ability to coin money. Number 4, the right and ability to declare war and peace. And number 5, the right to enter into treaties. These are the macro-scale components of the Law of Nations, a work published by Emer de Vittel in French and English, and influenced the establishment of the United States of America and the United Nations. It is a work that established the basis for the eventual creation of a one-world corporation under which vassal states of corporate nations in bankruptcy would be completed during the 20th century, knitted together in the template of the global estate via the Law of Nations. Essentially, the 5 powers granted to the Virginia Company are the primary and foundational powers later to be vested in the United States by the Constitution for the United States of America, thus establishing the logical conclusion that the United States is in fact the Crown Corporation holding company known as the Virginia Company. Letters of Marque and Reprisal. A letter of marque and reprisal is the decree, in letter patent, issued by a sovereign to the captains of his admiralty and private profiteers, also known as pirates, that they may legally board and capture the ship of another sovereign with whom the issuing sovereign is at war. This is the accepted law of the high seas and amongst the law of nations and the acceptable rules of war. This gains further insight into the situation on the land where all of the people have been placed into vessels of commerce, as we have described, and attorneys at law are given a title of nobility as an esquire from the Crown and its City of London 4 Inns of Court. Why is this important? Because in order to achieve the title of esquire, one must have also achieved at minimum the rank of captain. Thus, all attorneys at bar who have taken an oath to the bar, as members of the 4 Inns of Court, as esquires, are captains of the ships they command, flying the flag of the sovereign they serve, the Crown Corporation, and carrying their bar cards, which are, in fact, letters of marque and reprisal. This bar card as a letter of marque and reprisal enables them to board the vessels of enemy ships, vessels in commerce, and bring such ships, their crew and cargo, to the Admiralty courts of the sovereign for the dispensation of the prize and booty by the plundering of the goods of such enemy ships, you and me. And what is the secret to prevent one from being boarded as an enemy combatant and brought into the court of the admiral to be educated for plunder of one's bounty? To declare peace and fly a neutral flag of peace. Plus, a lot of hard work, study, research, and personal transformation.